and it's absolutely stunning. On Sunday nights, they would scour the archives for the tiny Ed Sullivan who had a smile on his face for millions of people. Something happened in 1955, though, and he snapped. Sullivan lost control and uttered remarks so terrible that onlookers couldn't believe it when a young musician altered just one tune. He ruined his impeccable reputation by using a racial slur. A physical altercation was nearly inevitable. Workers were compelled to separate them. No one brought it up for many years. The artist's ban was permanent. Rock and roll as we knew it will never be the same after what he did that night on live TV. Ed Sullivan was born in Harlem, New York, on September 28, 1901, as a set of identical twins. Daniel, his twin brother, had a prematurity illness and didn't make it past his first few months. With only Ed remaining as a twin, having a dark cloud cast over his formative years due to a loss he encountered. A calm melancholy and emptiness molded him even as a youngster. Peter and Elizabeth, his parents, were large-hearted Irish people. Of the 8 children born to Ed's parents, only 5 made it through the first year. Life and sorrow coexisted in the house. Another tragedy struck while Ed was only 5 years old. Another devastating loss for the family came with his baby sister's passing. The agony was too much for Elizabeth to bear. She made up her mind that they would uproot from Harlem and settle in the northern town of Portchester. Portchester exuded an air of tranquility. The loss never quite left Ed, despite his parents' hopes that the shift would aid in their healing. As a young lad, Ed figured out how to make it. Deeply saddened, people frequently referred to Ed as the miracle child because he managed to survive despite this. He grew up hearing music from all around the world because he was born into a neighborhood where Jewish and Irish families lived side by side. Ed soaked it all in as cars gradually supplanted horse-drawn carriages. Of his 8 siblings, just 5 made it past childhood. Life served as a constant reminder that, fragile, particularly his mother, he felt the embrace of his parents. He was a miracle for them. There was always music to deal with the sadness that lingered in the house. As they sang harmoniously around the piano, the Sullivans filled the halls with their music. They dealt with it through music. For the rest of his life, Ed would carry this habit. He would recall those formative years even as a popular TV host. Along with the way music may alleviate heavy burdens. A drive for control also manifested itself in Ed as he matured. Even in high school, he excelled on the athletic field. He received 12 letters in athletics between 1916 and 1919. He played football as a hard-nosed halfback, a swift point guard on the basketball floor. The athlete is a lightning sprinter. But as a baseball catcher and captain, he was at his best. His life was molded by his athletic pursuits. They taught him self-control and leadership skills. Furthermore, he thoroughly enjoyed taking the lead. Ed led the baseball team as captain, instructing his players on proper positioning and game strategy. As his fame grew, so did his string of championships. He gained a sense of power in that position that would be crucial later on in his career. When the United States entered World War I when Ed was 17 years old, he fled to Chicago in an attempt to join the Navy. They sent him back home since he was too young and didn't have the proper paperwork. He was daring in that failed endeavor. It also caused him to change his course. As a result, Ed had. Writing was also uncovered. He was the sports columnist and editor for the school newspaper while he was a student. He was employed by the Portchester Daily Item immediately following his graduation. Ed cherished every single one of the $1 articles he was compensated for. He would go on to work for the Hartford Post, the Evening Mail, the Associated Press, and, finally, the Evening Graphic in New York City. This was the beginning of his career as a journalist. Both writing and sports held a special place in his heart and soul, and they primed him for a far greater platform. Ed learned about fairness through sports as well. As a kid, he didn't give much thought to the fact that he played sports with black athletes. He found it effortless. He never considered it weird to meet teams in Connecticut that had black players when he went there for games. He carried that attitude of equality with him. Ed Sullivan would go on to host his own television show and support black performers by giving them a platform when others wouldn't. For Ed Sullivan, Taking a job at the Hartford Post in 1919 seemed like a huge leap forward in his career. His original idea to leave the Portchester Daily item for a bigger publication in search of greater chances quickly went down the drain. He was unemployed before he had a chance to settle in, since the Hartford Post went bankrupt in his first week on the job. Given the heyday of newspapers during that period, it was an incredibly strange and unfortunate setback. A few days is usually not enough time for a newspaper to close its doors. After learning that the newspaper industry was notoriously unstable, Sullivan had to start the job search process over from the beginning. Nonetheless, he continued on his way unabated. On the contrary, it just served to strengthen his resolve to press on. His early ambition and resilience were shaped by that brief and hard lesson. Sullivan got back up after the Hartford Post collapsed and worked as a sports writer for the Evening Mail in New York. However, it too went out of business in 1923. This was the beginning of a difficult time during which he went from failing newspaper to failing newspaper. The Associated Press, the Philadelphia Bulletin, the Morning World, the Morning Telegraph, the New York Bulletin, and the Leader were among his stops between 1923 and 1927. He was always on the hunt for a new job as soon as one of his publications folded. The majority of individuals would have step away. Sullivan just would not quit. He saw every position as an opportunity to learn new things and expand his professional network. Despite the risks and fatigue, it revealed his genuine love for journalism. Particularly formative were the years spent working for the Associated Press. When it came to news organizations, the AP was up there with the best of them. Sullivan continued freelancing for publications such as the Morning Telegraph and the Philadelphia Bulletin, but it was his employment with the AP that brought him national stories and increasingly demanding tasks. During this time, which ended in 1927, Sullivan gained experience in covering a wide range of topics, including sports and breaking events. Despite going through a series of work transitions, he established himself as a reliable storyteller and adaptable individual. He was already well established as an accomplished journalist when he departed the AP. Next, Sullivan did something monumental that year as well. He became a member of the New. I was a sports journalist for the York Evening Graphic. Known for its daring and frequently scandalous articles, the Graphic was ostentatious and loud. Sullivan flourished and rose rapidly through the ranks. His first permanent position of leadership came soon after, as sports editor. Even more infamous gossip journalist Walter Winchell, whom he met at the Graphic, was there. Upon Winchell's departure in 1929 for the Daily Mirror, Sullivan took up the role of Graphic's columnist for Broadway. He gained access to the entertainment industry and a new type of influence through that column. Sullivan was already well known when the firm dissolved in 1932. He joined the New York Daily News in 1932 as a columnist covering Broadway. Little Old New York, his now famous column, first appeared around that time. From its inception 42 years ago till 1974, readers kept checking it daily. Sullivan chronicled the highs and lows of the city's most prominent performers, Broadway plays, and actors. Because it was honest, crisp, and immersed in the drama at all times, his voice was beloved by many. Someone may become famous overnight with only one mention from Sullivan. Even those outside of New York City were able to follow the drama thanks to his syndicated column. Sullivan continued to adjust to the ever-changing entertainment industry year after year. That's the secret to his continued success. Along with his other roles, Sullivan served as a talent scout. The little city of New York was about more than only rumors. It served as a stepping stone for aspiring performers and actors. Before everyone else, Sullivan could spot talent. His column has the power to launch careers with just one encouraging remark. Conversely, a careless comment could damage someone's reputation if he disliked them. Producers and actors realized that a single line in his column could determine the fate of their program, so they read it every morning. It was more than that. Sullivan was reporting the news. He was handcrafting it. You could spot him at every major party and theatrical opening outside the newspaper offices. Sullivan was present whenever an event took place. The New York nightlife, however, was a separate battlefield in and of itself. The Sullivan opened for business at the world-renowned El Morocco Club. His de facto base of operations was that. Across town at the Stork Club, his adversary Walter Winchell was holding court. As Hollywood A-listers and politicians partied the night away, the two men competed for position. There was a contest for every renowned face that came through the doors. Winchell's store was well known for its select clientele and stringent entry policy. Power and glitz were hallmarks of Sullivan's El Morocco. The nightlife of New York City was controlled by these two columnists, and their antagonism was felt by everyone. It quickly rose to prominence as a city-wide conversation starter. Sullivan wasn't content to merely write. His reputation might be made or broken by his appearance at either club. He, too, had planned to dominate radio, just like Winchell. His debut radio program, CBS's The Ed Sullivan Show, premiered in 1932. He gained new fans and famous guests, such as George M. Cohan and Jack Benny, from that show. Sullivan continued presenting shows until 1946, when he hosted Ed Sullivan's Pipelines. His 1941 show was Ed Sullivan Variety, and his 1943 to 1944 show was Ed Sullivan Entertains. More and more people heard his name with each episode. For him, radio was ideal. His viewership grew, and he was able to means of disseminating rumors about the entertainment industry. Since he was a familiar voice, people started to trust him. He proved he could do more than just write with radio. In 1948, CBS made a bold move. Toast of the Town, a new variety show airing on Sunday nights, was hosted by Ed Sullivan. Without any background in television, Sullivan wrote columns for newspapers. A CBS executive named Marlo Lewis thought Sullivan's no-nonsense approach could be effective. It was unclear to Sullivan. "Everything they're promising to do is something I've already done," he said facetiously. On June 20, 1948, with a pitiful budget of $1.75, the pilot program broadcast. The appearance fees were as low as $200, even for Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin. Fear gripped the sponsors. William Paley, head of CBS, had faith in him, despite executives' concerns that he wasn't showy enough. The show was fashioned by Sullivan, who battled to get great guests, to a prosperous enterprise that persisted for almost 2 decades. A lot of suffering was necessary for that result. Detractors despised him. His wooden delivery was terrible in their eyes. According to what Harriet Van Horn wrote, he was completely uninteresting. Some of his detractors even went so far as to call him awkward and hopeless. It hit close to home for Sullivan. Even worse, he once penned a brief, vicious note, but those back home continued to keep an eye on it. Sullivan accomplished nothing, but did it better than anybody else, even according to Alan King's jokes. Sullivan figured out how to handle it. Comedians were allowed to portray him by him. His fame skyrocketed as a result. People liked his performances because he could make them laugh. Despite the sneers from critics, repeatedly returned. An integral aspect of the show's character was Sullivan's eccentric flair. He seems anxious on camera. His posture was perpetually slouched. The noise in his voice was somewhat nasal. They suspected he suffered from Bell's palsy. An article in Time magazine likened his grin to that of a lemon squeezer. However, he was perfectly healthy. A lot of people wrote to tell him how brave he was. His wooden movements became legendary, and comedians began to mimic them. This was an image that Sullivan never resisted. Actually, he welcomed it. His genuine charisma and hilarious antics propelled him to stardom. The program relocated to CBS Studio 50, located at 1697 Broadway, in 1953. Constructed in 1927, the theater was somewhat old. Stained glass and a Gothic ceiling made the interior look magnificent. Stowing cameras and equipment inside required some effort. To ensure interference-free operation, even the adjacent subway had to be protected. This theater was Sullivan's favorite. To commemorate its 20th anniversary on broadcast, CBS rechristened it the Ed Sullivan Theater in 1967. The rare honor for a television personality. This very theater stands today. Even though Stephen Colbert and David Letterman would eventually make it their home there, Sullivan and the other famous performers who appeared there are what most people remember it for. Toast of the Town was the original name for the program. Sullivan felt he wasn't given enough credit by this It was already widely believed to be his show. It was rechristened The Ed Sullivan Show on September 25, 1955 by CBS. To Sullivan, that was important. It solidified his status as a dominant figure in television. He would have Elvis Presley perform a year down the road. 60 million people tuned in to see Elvis. Considering the time, that was a television record. With his new moniker and the massive crowd, Sullivan was forever famous. However, Sullivan could be a pain at times. Bo Diddley was backstage on November 20, 1955. Sullivan overheard him performing Ernie Ford's smash tune, 16 Tons, from Tennessee. With only 3 weeks under its belt, that song had already sold over 1 million copies. Diddley was instructed by Sullivan to play it. Diddley likely thought it would be good for his career, so he consented. That changed, though, when he witnessed. He mistakenly believed he was supposed to accomplish both while reading Bo Diddley 16 Tons. Broadcast live. Instead, he played Bo Diddley his own tune. With that decision came one of the most defiant episodes of the early days of television. Diddley was performing in an R&B set. The audience went absolutely bonkers as he performed his own tune. Anger consumed Sullivan. A lasting impression was left by Diddley's unfiltered enthusiasm and renowned beat. The contagious Bo Diddley beat was initially heard by many Americans. It just took 2 minutes, but it altered the course of rock and roll irrevocably. Infuriated, Sullivan snapped when the cameras cut out. Then he became angry and shouted at Diddley. Diddley and eyewitnesses claimed that Sullivan went so far as to accuse him of being the first black youngster to ever betray him. That racial comment was very disgusting. Although Sullivan had previously advocated for black artists, his bigotry and irritability were on display here. The altercation was intense. Security had to physically restrain them. It was almost a brawl when the argument escalated. Sullivan made Diddley want to smack him. The management of Diddley attempted to reassure him. "That's Ed Sullivan," the manager cautioned. It didn't bother Diddley. Sullivan told him that he'd never work on TV again. "You won't last 6 months," he said. It was decreed that Diddley could not return. Despite Ed Sullivan's immense popularity on television, his daughter Betty has painted a drastically different picture. The speaker recounted her father's infamously explosive anger, which could burst over seemingly insignificant matters. Openly, Ed exuded composure. And charming. When he was alone, he could lash out at anyone. One time at home, Betty recounted, Ed became very angry and began yelling and banging doors after a minor argument. His relatives quickly learned to be cautious around him. They had no idea what could trigger his anger. On film, he rarely displayed this anger. It remained concealed beneath the well-known courteous grin. On the other hand, his unpredictable side was a daily reality for those closest to him at home. When asked about Ed's public demeanor, Betty said that he was completely different. Because of his program, even when the cameras weren't rolling, people assumed he was gregarious and easygoing. Truthfully, he tended to keep to himself. Being alone was something he enjoyed. Rather than enjoying himself or mingling with visitors after a broadcast, he would frequently seek refuge in his locker room. He was able to lose himself in a newspaper or TV show for hours even when he was at home. This state of mind persisted. It was just how he was. His co-workers and even his public persona as a gregarious host were so at odds with his actual solitary nature that they occasionally mistook his apparent coldness for coldness. There was a shadowy aspect to concerned about him when the Cold War was at its height. In one of Betty's anecdotes, Ed was led to believe that her lover had communist sympathies. At a time when widespread communist terror gripped the United States, this event occurred in the 1950s or 1960s. The boy's background was the subject of Ed's grilling of Betty. He thought of kicking him out of the house. His fear that his daughter was involved with a radical group led him to seek the counsel of others. Without any proof, it was just a wild assumption. During that era, even Ed Sullivan, who openly advocated for civil rights and had African American performers on his show, was not immune to the widespread anxiety. Even when it came to his feelings, Ed was a reserved man. According to Rob Precht, his grandson, Ed was not one to display affection or discuss his emotions very much. It was Rob's belief that Ed created this emotional facade. to bury suffering. Two of Ed's siblings, a sister and a twin brother, died at an early age. Because of these setbacks, he was cautious with his emotions. He never let his guard down or showed emotion, even as an adult. Rob reasoned that this contributed to Ed's icy demeanor toward outsiders and even some members of his own family. He seemed unfeeling on the outside, but there was a man behind that tough veneer. As an element, factors that molded his personality and the way he dealt with the demands of stardom. Even in his interactions with performers, he could see that conflict between his public persona and his private actions. The Doors were scheduled to perform live on his show on September 17, 1967. Light My Fire had to have a lyric changed before they could perform it, according to the producers. They felt the word higher implied drug use, so they wanted it removed. During rehearsal, the musicians communicated with the producers by nodding and agreeing. However, Jim Morrison informed the others they wouldn't be making any changes the moment they stepped out of the room. Even though they were anxious, the other members of the band supported him. Later, guitarist Robbie Kager stated, "I thought they were kidding. I responded with, 'Fuck it. Let's do it the way we do it.'" They ultimately opted not to give in. They played one song before breaking into Light My Fire. The cameras were rolling, millions of people were watching, and Morrison sang, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher," at the exact moment it mattered. Ed introduced them respectfully, as always, and the show went live that night. The audience was enthralled. On the other side of the stage, the producers' emotions were running high. Following the performance, Ed Sullivan himself stormed into their dressing room, allegedly yelling at the band and accusing them of betraying the show's and network's trust. The band was informed that they would not be appearing on the show again, but they were unconcerned. Jim Morrison reacted angrily when informed that they would never play on the show again. Famously responded, "But we just did." He shook his head and smirked slightly. Decades later, that moment still lives on in interviews, documentaries, and movies. It summed up the band's ethos. They had achieved what they wanted. They were on one of the largest stages in America, yet they had remained authentic. The Rolling Stones made an appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on January 15, 1967, with the intention of performing their new single, "Let's Spend the Night Together." However, the CBS producers of the show felt that the title was too sexual for family TV and ordered the band to either change the lyrics or not perform at all. The Stones, feeling the heat, decided to sing, "Let's Spend Some Time Together," instead. The incident became famous, illuminating the struggle between rock music and TV censorship and the immense power that television had over artists. Radio stations eventually followed suit. American television was very strict at the time, and they felt the original lyrics were too defiant. The Rolling Stones agreed, but they weren't happy about it. The success of the song in the US was damaged by the fact that many stations either bleeped the word "night" or refused to play it at all. However, the UK was unconcerned. The song was not censored there. However, even at that time, the Stones had a reputation for defying authority. They were known for breaking new ground. On Sunday night at the London Palladium, they made headlines for their controversial lip sync. The Ed Sullivan moment became one of the most famous censorship battles in rock history. Mick Jagger decided to make a statement during the show. He rolled his eyes at the camera every time he sang, "Let's Spend Some Time Together." It was a subtle gesture, but it caught people's attention. As a subtle but noticeable form of protest, the Stones' eye rolls gained notoriety. In contrast to Jim Morrison of The Doors, who was banned for refusing to change his lyrics, the band had agreed to change the words but retain their spirit. By rolling his eyes, Mick demonstrated that they could adhere to the rules while still maintaining their individuality. Confound them simultaneously. Some saw it as deliberate, others as Mick being himself. Whatever it was unforgettable. To this day, those few seconds are cited as an example of how a band could defy authority without actually breaking any rules. A few years prior to this, there was another infamous altercation with Ed Sullivan. On October 19, 1964. On the show, comedian Jackie Mason made an appearance. President Lyndon B. Johnson made a live announcement, which cut Mason's act short. When the show resumed, host Sullivan showed Mason two fingers off-screen to indicate that he had 2 minutes left. Mason then started making jokes about fingers, pointing at people and saying things like, "Here's a finger for you and a finger for you." Sullivan believed Mason was attempting to make a crude motion toward him. In Sullivan's perspective, Mason's thumb appeared to be a middle finger. Anger consumed Sullivan. Mason was offered a 6-show deal after the program. At the time, the deal was worth $45,000, which would be more than $450,000 now. Sullivan informed the news that Mason was ill and prone to unexpected behavior. Mason insisted he never snubbed Sullivan, but no one took him seriously. Sullivan was found not guilty of Mason's false suit. It was in every major newspaper and magazine. There was a major setback for Mason's career. Sullivan commanded respect. Skirmishing with him resulted in job loss. The majority of television networks barred Mason. It took him nearly 2 decades to get well. The damage to Mason's reputation persisted even after Sullivan reinstated him on the program and offered an apology. His famous gaffes on live television are what people will remember him for. He was considered too dangerous to book by the producers. Mason was compelled to perform bit parts and small club work. Re-establishing his profession was a process that took years. The finger incident remained fresh in everyone's minds even at that late hour. Learning not to cross Sullivan was a tough lesson. There was more to Sullivan than that. He guarded entryways. A career may be ruined if you went against him. Who could be on Sullivan's show? Sullivan was quite picky about it. His rules were followed by many artists. Famous people even include. It was necessary for Elvis Presley to film from his waist up. It was Sullivan who would often rule on matters of propriety. Still, people were surprised to see another side to him. He booked more black singers than other presenters of his day, despite his authoritarian and severe personality. Sullivan began providing African American performers with a national platform in 1948. During this period, segregation and racism were prevalent. He was instructed by several sponsors not to book them anymore. An executive from Ford once advised him to cease. He was expelled from the theater by Sullivan. People should prioritize talent over intolerance, according to Sullivan. A number of famous musicians graced his program, including James Brown, The Supremes, Ella Fitzgerald, Sammy Davis Jr., and Louis Armstrong. Civil liberties emerged as leaders, such as Ketta Scott King. Sullivan was reckless. That was one reason why he was so beloved. Some people saw through his hypocrisy. He had a reputation behind the scenes for blacklisting artists like Bo Diddley who dared to disobey him. Nonetheless, he did more than others to promote black actors and actresses on cinema. While Sullivan was in office, his show remained airing continuously for 23 years. From June 20, 1948, to June 6, 1971, it was broadcast on CBS. It's more than 1,000 episodes. Countless Americans tuned in each Sunday. The likes of Elvis Presley and the Beatles were all exposed to them by Sullivan. Notable comedians Carol Burnett and Richard Pryor were also on hand. On February 9, 1964, when the Beatles performed, the audience size was at 73 million. For its day, that was unprecedented. Strict control was Sullivan's claim to fame. The only part of Elvis that was exposed was his waist. Lyrics were altered by the Rolling Stones. Still, Sullivan's show might be a career maker or a career ender for some. In 1971, the show was finally canceled by CBS. Sensed a period's conclusion. Not long after that, Sullivan passed away. Sylvia, his wife, passed away on March 16, 1973. After meeting in 1926, they were married since April 28, 1930. Since she was Jewish and he was Catholic, they initially kept their connection a secret. They went so far as to inform her relatives that Ed Sullivan was Sullivan's real name. At 1930 City Hall, they eloped. Elizabeth, their daughter, was born 8 months later. Teamwork was key for the Sullivans. Sylvia was very candid in her post-show critiques of Ed. He was devastated when she passed away in 1973. Sullivan got his own esophageal cancer diagnosis a year after that. The truth may not have been told to him by his family. For fear of upsetting him, they decided against it. After a few weeks, Sullivan departed. His passing occurred at the age of 73 on October 13, 1974. His funeral was placed at the Cathedral of St. Patrick. After seeing him, Paul McCartney recalled that Sullivan had forgotten his identity. So much had changed in Sullivan's life by that point. Years down the road, Sullivan's daughter Betty and grandson Rob discussed his domineering personality. In 1952, Betty tied the knot with Bob Pree, the show's producer. She had witnessed firsthand how Ed took care of every little thing. His obsession with detail made Sullivan renowned. His loved ones were not immune. Sullivan, according to Rob's anecdotes, was both gentle and tough. The same man who cherished his loved ones also forbade performances by those who disturbed him. Most people thought this guy was simply a stiff TV personality, but these revelations exposed a different side of him. The mood of Sullivan may swing from warm to angry in an instant. This side of him was exclusively seen to his family, despite the fact that millions of people watched him on Sundays. Even after the cameras stopped rolling, they could still feel it.